Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jean Oy. I'm the professor of political science and also the director of the China program at the Asia Pacific Research Center and director also of the Stanford Center at Peking University. Today, we are very privileged to have actually as the last program of the year for this regular seminar series, to have Professor Fu Jun from Peking University. And he is going to be talking on a subject about what does China have to do to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. This is particularly, I think, apt to have right now, given that Stanford just received this wonderful $1 billion plus donation for our new School of Sustainability. And so obviously, whether China achieves this carbon neutrality or not is going to be a major factor in about whether globally we can achieve carbon neutrality. So this is really a very, very important topic. And I'm also very pleased to be able to introduce Fu Jun. Because he got his degree from Harvard University, and he actually sat in some of my classes many, many years ago. So he got his PhD at Harvard, and then he returned to China, where he has held very important roles at the two leading universities in China. He first went back and was at Tsinghua University, and then he moved to Peking University, where he has been a professor at the School of Public Policy. And he actually was the dean not long ago, before then moving over to the National School of Development. Although your appointment is not actually in the School of Development, but he's heading some important research institutes. He started his career off studying international political economy, and he published a very good study with the University of Michigan. He's also published in Chinese, Pathways to Prosperity. But this book that just came out in 2021, on climate mitigation, adaptation in China policy, technology, and market, is really I think, a coming together, as he was just telling me, of his work in public policy, his collaboration and work in the National School of Development, which really is beginning to focus on this very important topic of carbon, how China is going to achieve carbon neutrality. So today he's going to be talking about the parameters, policies, and the prospects of China's role in meeting these global goals. Now, I will be we're going to have Professor Fu give about 35 minutes of comments, and then we will have questions and answers. I will curate the questions. Please, if you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A box, and then we will have discussion after his comments. So Fu Jun, welcome to Stanford, and thank you for coming to talk to us about this very important topic.
Thank you, Jean, for this opportunity to present the research being done here at Peking University to our colleagues at Stanford University and beyond. The title today is What Does China Have to Do to Achieve Carbon Neutrality by 2060? It's a long-term objective, but the work has to start now, and even the work started a decade ago, and with some implications for green finance and international cooperation. Now, this is an area that I think, in spite of all the tensions and the difficulties between big countries, now it's an area that the powers will have to cooperate. Otherwise, we as a human species are in deep trouble. Well, this talk actually is based on a new book, as Jean mentioned. Actually, it's a collective work of what I would call a triple helix between the school, a policy school, and the School of Engineering, and the business school at Peking University. And we think to have collective work is very important because given the subject, we have to be interdisciplinary. And I serve as a principal investigator, if you may, of this efforts. And it's out now as a book, actually, just in time for last year's climate work conference by the UN in UK. Today, I will just give you some outline of what I'm going to say so that we have plenty of time for question and answers. I will sort of cover the current status of China. In other words, China as a big economy, how much China is contributing to CO2 emission and other climate-related things in the global picture. Then I sort of cover the policy dimension, then the technology dimension, and the market I would call institutional dimension. And then I will say a bit about the projection models we do to project forward in terms of policy, in terms of technology and institutional technology, and not least nature-based solutions as China continue to move forward. What dynamic combinations of all three those things will configure to meet the ultimate objective of achieving carbon neutrality by 2060. Then a bit of implications for green finance and international cooperation, because the last part is very important because we have to work together, all countries, to make that happen. Climate has no borders, even though geographically on Earth, physically, we have borders. Now, to give you a sense of China's contribution to CO2 emissions, in aggregate amount, the share of China is close to 2/3 of the world's total, even though CO2 emission at the time in China continues to be low, a little bit above world average, but compared with the United States, the number is about 14 or 15 tons per capita each year. China now is 7 tons each year. It's probably on par now with that of the European Union. Now, to think about it in the Einstein equation, E equals mc squared, right? At the end of the day, wealth is a function of energy consumption in a way. Now, the start factor is that China's CO2 emission per capita is about 7 tons each year. European Union about the same, but in terms of income or GDP per capita, we have to think why the ratio is 4:1 between EU and China. There are implications for continued reforms in China. Probably there are 2 areas we need to look very closely. One is institutions. In other words, China needs to continue to reform towards the market so that we can continue to increase in terms of allocative efficiency. And that has deep implications for the creation of ideas, new ideas. So institution ideas, as long as China continue to move that way, our economy will continue to rise in terms of GDP per capita. So in a way, CO2 emission is a reflection of levels of development, not only here in China, but everywhere in the world. If you look at all countries, the developed part, China in the middle, the developing part. So given that, the policy stand early on 10 years ago, say, was what's called a CBR, Common but differentiated responsibilities. If you look at the developing world, CO2 emission tend to be very, very low. They do not sort of burn energy a lot. And if you have a satellite picture of the world, the big cities are all lit brightly, whereas the rural areas very dark. So that gives you a visual picture of the consumption of energy globally. I guess this is a very close approximation of the level of development, and behind that is energy. China in the past year has been moving very aggressively from a fossil-based energy structure to non-fossil energy. It's not just started today, 10 years ago. So this picture shows the green part, non-fossil part. You can see it's been growing very significantly in the past decades. The green stands for non-fossil part. Basically, we are talking about wind and the solar energy. Then, in spite of the very aggressive increase of those, the fossil part continued to dominate. Coal in particular still is about 60% of the energy structure here in China. As things stand now, the ratio between fossil and non-fossil fuel in China is about 85 to 15, 85% of fossil fuel, whereas 15% non-fossil fuels. As were mentioned later on, by the end of 2060, we need to flip that order. But our figure will be more conservative than the figure that the Tsinghua University previous shows. Now, to make that happen, let's look at the policy dimension of what China has been doing. When we move from fossil to non-fossil fuels, philosophically, there are, to me at least, very sort of subtle but visible policy change from what I would call particular justice to now general justice. Other people probably have not noticed that. By particular justice, the word we use or emphasize is carbon equity. Equity has a sense of a particular justice. We are different, probably for historical reasons or whatever. General justice is, well, you have a sense of justice that applies to everyone. When China announced the policy to reach carbon neutrality, from carbon equity to carbon neutrality, there is a very subtle but a very important philosophical change from particular justice to general justice. And with a time framework, we'll do that with a time lag of 10 years after most advanced economies. So for most of the advanced economies, they will say they reach carbon neutrality by the year of, mostly by the year of 2050, whereas China will reach carbon neutrality or net carbon zero by 2060, given historical reasons, given the stage of development, the process of industrialization and urbanization. Urbanization rates by incidentally here in China is roughly 60%. 40 years ago, less than 20%. And that for advanced economy is about 80%. Then if you look at other developing countries, very, very low in terms of urbanization. So this reflects levels of development. But in any case, China has moved from particular justice philosophically to general justice, but with the allowance of 10 years. And for India, for instance, 10 years after China's pledge. So given their level of development, they want to have a longer period. But to make that happen, even from 10 years ago, China has pledged, and we have achieved that, to lower carbon intensity by 45% from 2005 to 2020. And another pledge to increase renewables as a share of total from 9% to now 15%. We have achieved that. And in the transition period, and the emphasis now made very explicit is to have the sequencing right. It's a phase in and a phase out. We need to have a phase in, new technology phase in before you phase out older things. Otherwise, the process will be problematic. And still another pledge is to peak carbon emission before 2030. This is a new pledge. And our estimate of that is before that, China probably will peak at 11.27 billion tons. There are different estimations, but according to our study, it's 11.27 billion tons. So roughly you're looking at about 10, a bit over 10 billion tons. Then we peak, then hopefully it will go down. And a more significant one is the pledge to achieve carbon neutrality, net carbon zero by 2060. And to make that happen, we need to flip the order of our current energy structure from a ratio of, as I said, 85 to 15% fossil vis-a-vis non-fossil. To flip that is, according to our estimation, is 20% fossil, 80% non-fossil, whereas Tsinghhua's previous estimation was 15 non-fossil, 85 non-fossil. I think probably that would be difficult, as I'll explain later on. But to make that happen, basically technology will play a very, very critical role. And if we look at the technology, there are basically three sets technology to make that happen. One is what I would call low carbon. The other is zero carbon. And the last one is negative carbon. I will explain a bit of each. Low carbon means China will, the current level of energy intensity is twice as much as Germans. In other words, there are huge space for us to lower carbon intensity given the current set of technology. But as we move forward, over time, we will face the emission effects of improvements of the current stock of technology. In other words, that would indicate we eventually will have to adopt new technologies. But the process is not just a clear cut. Oh, you have to have a phase in, phase out period. For the technology horizon, we should do R&D now so that by the time we have a more comfortable time for those to phase into the total picture. Zero carbon means green technology. Basically, you are talking about wind and solar energy. China has been doing these two things, wind and the solar, in a very aggressive way. But the problem is the compatibility between the energy generated by wind and the solar with the current grid system. This is what I would call VRE, variable renewable energy compatibility. With the current grid set, the ratio is very low, about 15%. Okay, it means even though we have a lot of wind and solar power, but the transmission system is not compatible with the current level of energy generated by wind and the solar. And these indicate the bottlenecks, technological bottlenecks of the two. Even though renewable energy, the cost of renewable energy has been going down very dramatically. Now, this has deep implications for R&D and research into hydrogen. And in the area of hydrogen, basically we're talking about 3 sets of hydrogen. One is gray hydrogen. You use traditional energy to produce hydrogen. It's gray because the source of energy is not clean. It could be generated by oil, gas, or coal. But then another set is what we call blue hydrogen. Blue hydrogen means the source is not clean, but you can use CCUS technology, for instance, to capture CO2, so that when you use hydrogen, this is sort of the source is not clean, but the end use is clean. But the better choice, of course, is green hydrogen. In other words, in the whole process of producing energy, you remain green. You use, for instance, wind and solar power to produce hydrogen. Then you develop better storage system, transportation system. The end users are also clean. Now, it is important because, as I said, because the incompatibility between variable renewable energy and the current grid system in areas, the northeastern area where we have plenty of wind and solar, one thing that we can imagine is to develop green and solar energy and link that with green energy. Wind power, even in the coastal parts, if we set those up in the sea, and that conceivably could also be a good source to produce green hydrogen. The last set of technology is what I would call negative carbon technology. Here, in particular, we are looking at CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. China has set up over 25%. As we did the study, probably the number is now close to 30 CCUS projects. And our judgment is policy-wise, China probably will see those as the reserve technology of a last resort. When all else fail, eventually will use the CCUS to capture CO2 emissions. The challenge currently, the current challenge is it's not commercially viable. It's too expensive. But in the hope, as China continues to move forward with the placement of development of carbon markets, carbon prices goes up, that would make the development of CCUS and the deployment of CCUS more commercially viable, and with a bit of subsidies from the government. But when you use that CCUS, one thing to consider is also to build clusters of storage linked with sites of emission, so that as an integrated system, you have the scale economy. And our judgment is China probably is institutionally better fitted to do that, given the system we have. Land belong to the state, and if our construction process of a highway, not just a highway, it's a real high-speed railway is an indication. China is in a good position to build full chain CCUS facilities. Now, the last set of technology is what I would call institutional technology. This is extremely important because it has deep political and economic implications. The theory behind that, of course, is a cap and a trade. Cap means you need to have the political will to cap the total quota. Then the second market is trade. And for us to set up, and for the world, even in the developing countries, to set up institution technology, they call it emission trade system. Basically, it's a system that allows us to better align economic incentives with the values by sending price signals. And with that, we have a better chance to level the playing ground for the development of green technology that economize on carbon emission. This, I guess, probably is a most sophisticated, humanly built technology, institution technology. This is the thing that China has been doing even in the past 10 years. But we all understand that China is a continental economy. It's not just a small city. And there are vast regional variations across China. China has been tested the viability of carbon markets in different parts of China. And the policy framework is an N-to-1. It is one means a unified framework, but then we need to sensitize a unified conceptual framework to the actual conditions across China. That's, as I say, it's N1+N strategy. The logic applies to China's experiments with the carbon market system as well. We basically set up 8 regional ETS pilots in the past 10 years. And based on the experience and lessons we learned from that 8 regional pilots last year, China start to operate one unified national ETS system. But the coverage so far is only about the power sector. Power sector emits about 45% of CO2. And the second is the steel industry, roughly 15%. Cement, roughly 12 to 15%. So these are the chunks of emissions here in China. But so far, our national ETS has not included steel, cement, and other 8 major industries. But the vision is that over the years we'll gradually include these sectors as well. And of course, the way you distribute the quotas to different industries has a deep distributive justice. What China do so far is basically grandfathering, but increasingly we also experiment with auctioning of those quotes. And the basic process also apply the general logic of the whole process of China's reforms and opening up a process. It's very sort of learning by doing stuff. And the area that is so unique to carbon market is an information system, and it's called MRV, monitor, report, verification. And we have to do a lot on that front so that the system can work. Now with this, how these different technologies will play out years down the road as China move towards the ultimate goal of reaching carbon neutrality by 2060. We have done simulation modeling for that, and the parameters of model is a combination of what we call PPA plus MBA plus CCS plus MBS. PPA stands for public policy approach. MBA stands for market-based solutions. In particular, we are looking at carbon markets or the price of carbon. CCS, carbon capture storage, or CCUS, carbon capture utilization and storage. MBS, by MBS, we are talking about nature-based solutions, plant trees, the kind of thing. Now, we do the formulation model by plug in either a single policy or a combination policy and sensitize that with the development of carbon markets and with our estimate of the capacity of the CCUS years down the road, and also the ability of nature-based solutions to capture carbon emission. The result was by 2060, simply put, our energy structure will be changed from the current one to a one in the future where 20% will remain fossil fuel, 80% non-fossil fuel. This is a more conservative figure than the figure that Tsinghua University showed previously. And with that, what about the remaining 20% fossil fuel? CCUS will take care about 1 billion CO2 whereas to clean up the fossil fuel, whereas another 1 billion will be taken care of by the nature-based solutions. So this is the scenario we are looking at. And with that, we are reasonably confident that China can reach that objective, that is carbon neutrality by 2060. But I have to add with a caveat, simulation is different from emulation. Simulation is very deductive, different scenarios, but where emulation is a process of learning. In other words, what China will go through in reality probably will be a very massive process of a bit of induction, a lot of deduction, and in the process make a lot of adjustment in the process to sensitive to the frontier of technology, sensitive to our cooperation with the rest of the world. And the key is, if you are concerned about energy structure, the sequencing has to be correct. In other words, when you use technology, phasing period is very important before you phase out the traditional stuff. Otherwise, you will be suffering from the gaps of transition. I'm going to skip the technicalities of separate modeling on policy, on markets, the price and the things, but jump to the last bit of this presentation, that is say a few words about implication of green financing and international cooperation. Since this study, we have also talked to other scholars and consulted with them. Michael Spence, for instance, come up with the figure globally, the money for all countries, the total amount of green-oriented investment, his estimation was about 3 to 3.5 billion globally. Now, given that China's emission takes about 1/3 of the global total, so imagine if 1/3 of money is used here, probably it's reasonable because China now is the manufacturing powerhouse of the world. So the money we need will be about 1 to 1.1 billion each year to make that happen. That means a lot of investment of green and green finance. And the typical projects that need money to do, for instance, renewable energy and energy efficiency, sort of to reduce energy intensity, pollution prevention, control, biodiversity conservation, circular economy initiative, sustainable use of natural resources and land. This is what I would sort of call nature-based solutions. And because, as I indicated early on, climate is global, and to make for us to fight against the climate change effectively globally, China is a big part of the picture, will have to be engaged very intensively with other parts of the world. For instance, even when we look at carbon market, the standards that we set and the price levels we set, even though currently the gap is so huge. EU, the price is close to 80 euros per ton, whereas here in China it's below 50 RMB. And eventually we need to see a convergence of those prices here in China, EU, United States, such that we really set up a level playing ground for all countries to move forward. So with that, let me end here, and I'm ready for questions and answers. Thank you.
Very much, Fu Jun. That was very interesting, and also a lot of material there. Let me start out by asking you questions. I mean, these are very laudable goals, but I wondered if you could say more about implementation and the challenges in implementation. And so let's just start out with the problems about sort of what you call the VRE problems, that there's this current compatibility issue that is not able to actually transmit the energy that is being, all of the energy that's being produced. And so for that one alone, like, can you just say a bit more? Why can't China make this compatible? You know, who are the key actors that would make the decisions? Is it a question of money? Is it technology? I mean, I asked this because I know that you and I both, you know, we've studied political economy of China, and we know that, you know, China has always had beautifully written regulations about environmental protection, but there are always problems of implementation because of the interest of different actors. And so with regard to something like this, where on the one hand, China has the capability of producing, you know, more, you know, renewable energy, what can you tell us, you know, what are the problems then about why isn't it compatible?
Well, let me start with the VRE, variable renewable energy, and I can use that as an indication for other problems we have, even the area of implementation of that, because I think this is a good case. Conceptually, if you have a lot of wind and solar generated power, then you have a grid system, and you sort of link those to the end users. If you think a very unified national system. But the reality of China is not like that. China is categorized by a regional heterogeneity, because you have the center, you have also local interest, and the power generators are scattered up and down China. Each provinces have their own power generators in a way, even though it's not homogeneous, but you still see structural differences.
I mean, excuse me, let me just intervene here a second for clarification, because this is the question I was really wondering about, but this seems quite decentralized. Does this mean that the compatibility issue is because different localities are using different types of what, equipment, or why is it so hard to unify?
The source of energy varies across different regions. Some regions are rich in renewable energy, whereas others, they are rich in fossil fuels. For instance,
I see.
They have their current stock of technology. And of course, if you just remove, get rid of the current stock, and that has deep implications for social, political implications. What about employment and things? So you have to have a phase-in and a phase-out process when you do the implementation. But given the current status of a grid system, when power is generated by wind and solar, rich in northeastern areas, and for the current system to accept those power, the ratio is about 15%, given the current grid system. Hopefully we can elevate that to 25 to 30%. In other words, when you generate in those northeastern areas, if you generate power by wind and solar, a lot of that will be wasted at the moment because of the low ratio of compatibility between variable renewable energy and the current grid system, even though we consider super I don't know the technical term for 超高压. It's a super high pressure voltage, high voltage transmission system. We have the technology there.
Okay, so because this is clearly a technical issue that I am very weak in, but I want to just ask you to help me and perhaps others in the audience. So is the problem that the current state grid across the country is not yet capable of accepting the energy that is generated by some of the, like, for example, wind or
no, you're right.
So that is the problem. And
yes.
so that what
the capacity is about 15% currently.
So this is where
now you have the older system, then you say, okay, I will give a space about 15% of the current capacity for power generated by wind and solar sources.
Okay, but is this then would necessitate, for example, if Beijing decided they wanted to do this, they would have to go and to upgrade the entire state grid.
Well, this is one of the technology pathways. As I said, hopefully will increase the ratio from 15% to 30%.
Okay.
That would make a system better. But what about the currently wasted energy generated by wind and solar? Then the current consideration is to develop hydrogen. See, you use wind and solar generated power to produce hydrogen. Then you develop the storage system for store hydrogen, and also the transportation system, then the end use. Now, this has deeper implications for end use of clean energy. Even though we have been talking about electrification of automobiles, we set up an infrastructure. But if the source is not clean, then it's not clean. If the source is clean, then it's the whole process is clean. And in a way, in terms of implementation, even when we went ahead to electrify a lot of automobiles with the fueling system, even though at the moment the source is not clean, but you need to have the infrastructure first. But over time, you gradually sort of align the green source with the infrastructure you have. There will be misalignments in the process, but the vision was that over a period of time, you will have a better alignment of the two systems. Now, Northwest is different from the East Coast. East Coast, for instance, there is it's conceivable to develop wind power along the coast lines, so that when you set up a basis to produce hydrogen by using those wind power generated energy, And this is a consideration and a closer geographically to the East Coast areas. Then Northwest, it's wind power, wind and solar power. Then we have hydraulic power in the Southwest, a lot of hydraulic power. These are green sources of energy.
Okay, let me ask another. We have a number of questions coming in, but I want to just ask one more. And that it's along the similar lines, because clearly you've pointed out the differences in the different regions, different types of energy. And so I want to get your sense of, one, obviously there needs to be large investments in the infrastructure, but there's also, I think, a question of coordination. So can you tell us a bit more about then what is the relationship between the role of local authorities, local governments, and Beijing? Because I think that many, I think of China, that Beijing is, obviously has a lot of authority and power. But regarding this, to make this really work, can you say more about what the relationship is and who's supposed to do what?
That is indicated by our pronounced policy of 1+N. One stands for 1+N policy. Sort of you have a unified policy framework over a period of time. This is a very strong indication for the local governments that this is the way we will go. But during that period of time, that policy framework will have to be sensitized for local conditions. So you have variations when you seek local conditions. And remember, the uniqueness of Chinese political economy, if I say, even though it's market-driven reform so far, we have 5-year plans, see?
Right.
So you sort of have one unified goal, then the local governments will have to figure out over a period of time how to converge towards the goal. And every 5 years, as I said, it will be a very deductive and inductive tinkering process. There will be spaces for local governments to make suggestions and also to apply for extra allowances from the central government. So from a period from now to 2060, it will be a very, very massive process for what we would call deductive and inductive tinkering process. And China probably is unique in that, well, given the system, in achieving carbon neutrality, my judgment is China probably is in a better position, given the system, to do that, if we have the political will to do that,
Okay, let me stop. Thank you. Let me take some questions from the audience. One question has to do with the calculation of the question is, carbon calculation, is it unified globally? And as I understand, this is actually an issue, that there isn't a standard way of calculating this?
Conceptually, if you have a unified way, it's good, but the process will be indicated by still 1+N. Ultimately, it's a convergent process, and it will take time. And in the meantime, you probably need to consider arbitration of prices and the taxation. For instance, the EU has indicated it will impose cross-border taxes. But then the issue is that once you have collected taxes, in what way will you use the taxes? But I guess since this is a collective work against climate crisis, my suggestion would be to use that money for technology transfer to other developing countries, so that the globe as a whole will in a better position to fight against climate change. So to put it short, we need to be sensitive to local conditions, but we also need to have a unified framework. And the United Nations, in a way, has set up that framework. You have a general framework, but with the pledges of national pledge from different countries. But over time, you converge. So that itself is a very sophisticated human institutional setup. But United Nations, of course, also has its shortfalls because it's a quasi global government. It is not a sovereign government. Eventually, you cannot impose, especially United Nations is not in a position to impose its will on big powers. This is a very harsh reality given the unequal nature of the international system. Persuasion, first among big powers so that they feel comfortable with each other to work together, then you go from there. You set up a framework for other countries.
Okay, thank you. We have another question, it's a long question, but the gist of it is that in addition to policy making and market function, the questioner is wondering about public participation and stressing that should not be neglected. And the question is, what is government, what can government and research institutes do to improve public consensus and motivate them to be involved in this process of achieving carbon neutrality?
Well, the things that has mentioned are all important. The public policy, participation on the parts of private citizens, media is very important, education is very important. But what we are looking at insofar as this book is concerned is a public policy, technology, and the markets. But of course, it takes much more than these to make the whole thing happen. If you want to change the behavior, okay, incentive is very important, but also the concepts that we have, the value we have, what is good life? Is it want-based or need-based? And these are all important things that we need to educate all citizens, private citizens, corporations, then policymakers. There is no question. Right.
Since you did mention incentives, I wonder if you could just say a few more words. Like, are there ways or what policies are currently being used to give those areas that are still, rich and invested in fossil fuels to move to more sustainable sources of energy? Like, how do you get these localities?
Well, in China, we have had a system of resource transfers. You're an expert on that, right? Transfers of resources from rich to poor areas, and the central government behaves as the grandfather. They collected the central government taxation, but a big part of that, 80%, if I remember correctly, will be used for transfer to those rural areas. So you can take that as a Chinese specific system of financial resource transfers. And I guess that logic will also apply to the work of fighting against climate change. As you play up renewables, play down traditional fuels, and you need to also have the benefits of resource transfers. And China has the institutional capacity, in a way, to do that. We are in a much comfortable position than the EU system, for instance, and probably the US system to do that, given the nature of central local relations here in China.
We have a question about the carbon credits that you were talking about. And the question is, do you expect the carbon credits generated in China could be sold overseas where pricing is better? If so, would this accelerate decarbonization in China?
The end game, yes, short answer, but it will take a process. China has been experimenting with the carbon credits. And as I said, monitoring the information system is so important. So as a converging process, I would say yes, but for the time being, it will be problematic.
Well, on this topic, I was also wondering if you could say a bit more about the 8 carbon markets, that have been tried for what I think you said 10 years. Have you, looking at the history of those markets, where did they seem to work best, and what were the biggest challenges?
We said about 8. We have done very sort of detailed study of the 8 market. The Tianjin market does not seem to do well, probably because burdened by the traditional infrastructure layout of a lot of SOEs with the big heavy industries. The Hubei is doing well. The control, the policy sort of was synthetic control modeling is very compelling. It's doing very well. Shanghai is doing well in terms of the information system. And when China rolled out its national unified carbon market, Shanghai continues to be an information center. It makes sense because it's compatible with their financial center. But in Sichuan, in the interior parts of China, they also experiment with green gas emission. So because of the different monitoring system. So that in those areas, we have started to learn to report and calculate green gas other than just the CO2. So giving all these, and the Beijing, if we sort of say a policy intervention before and after, you do not see significant impacts. But the reason probably was that because for the 2008 Olympic Games, Beijing has moved out a big part of its CO2 emitters. So even when you impose carbon trading, the impact was not as significant as others. Shenzhen seems to be doing well as well. So if all things considered, there are different characteristics, but then as an N1 and 1 plus N system, it seems there are initial evidence to support the strategy of moving out sensitive different regional differences. Then eventually we need to have a unified system. But as I said, the unified system today deals with the power sector. This is the bulk of our emission of 45% total. Then it has not covered other industries, because other industries are scattered heterogeneously across different parts of China. So it makes sense looking back to move out of the power sector first and eventually to gradually include other sectors as well, so that the localities have a time to make an adjustment as they move forward.
I wonder, I know this is a very technical subject, but I would love to know a little bit more if you could tell us, how does this actually work? So for example, you said that in Tianjin, it wasn't working as well because this legacy of industry. So like, who is part of the carbon market? Do firms sign up? How does this work? Like who coordinates this in a city, for example?
You have the central authority, and in the case of locality, then it's far away reforms and the Development Commission, sort of. Then the players for that market is firms, industrial firms. Then they need to report their emissions.
So I'm sorry. So these industrial firms, like which firms actually participate? Is it voluntary, or are they? What is? Can you tell us a little more about that?
They will not voluntary. You'll be covered. You will be covered by the system, especially the big ones. But eventually, that coverage will expand. They cover the big ones because it will be relatively easy for them to get the information. So and they need to be part of that reporting verification, MRV system. They're going to get the quotas because they need to get the quotas from the center or the government, allowances of quotas from the local governments. Then they are part of the trading system.
So you were talking about the power sector. Does that mean that different firms engaged in the generation of power, that all of them are part of this market? They all?
The national carbon market now covers the power sector. The regional pilots covered a longer list of industrial firms.
So I guess what I wanted to know is who decides what firms are part of this? So it's a Fakaway, the NDRC says, you know, this sector is going to be part of the market?
Yes.
And then every firm that's in that sector has then a quota?
Yes. They start with the most significant polluters.
And so
because power sector is so obvious. Steel is so obvious. Cement is so obvious.
Right, exactly.
Petrochemical is so obvious. See.
And then the people that are actually monitoring their use and such, is that with the Environmental Protection Bureau, or does Fagaway come back in to do this?
They will set up a website to receive the reports and for registration because eventually for you to protest, you need to have the quotas from the government, the Fagaway. Because as I said, it's a cap and a trade. So you need to have the allowances first. And for most of the regional pilots, it's grandfathering system first. Then in Shenzhen and Shanghai, if you use up all your quotas, then you need to buy the auctions of the quotas. So Shanghai experimented early on with the auction system in addition to grandfathering. So it's grandfathering auction. It's a better combination. Whereas for most of the local, regional carbon pilots, it's grandfathering. But I guess that logic would eventually apply to the unified national market system as well. Grandfathering first, and increasingly, then you incorporate the portion of auctioning.
Okay, great. Well, there's obviously a lot of questions, but our time is up, and I just really congratulate you on the publication of this very important book, and I look forward to reading in detail and getting more of the details. And I encourage you to keep working on this very important topic. And this is one area where I think there can and should be cooperation, regardless of what else is going on in the relations between different countries. So thank you very much, and see you again. Thank you, and thank the audience for the good questions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.